Hey, Deserving listeners, Trial, let's watch. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast and YouTube channel. Let's watch.
Let's look back at some of those domestic violence checklists that you were talking about.
Okay.
Did you see any problem with the use of those?
First of all, they shouldn't be used. So we do have professional standards that require that we utilize instruments that are relevant and appropriate for the particular setting, and that we substantiate our opinions based on data that is reliable from tested, accurate, reliable tests for the purpose. So there's that. It's inconsistent with the ethics. And essentially, they just shouldn't be used. They don't provide us with the robust information that it would be expected in such a high-stakes setting.
Okay, so she's saying that Dr. Hughes committed an ethical violation, or I don't know what word she would use, but it's not ethical, she says, to use those checklists because they're not useful in a forensic setting, perhaps even deceptive, right? I would say that, for me anyway, it would be unethical if you portrayed the data from those tests to be something other than self-report, and also to claim that research shows that people who answer it in this way are not feigning, because I doubt there's any evidence of that. But, you know, you could, in my book, but I could be wrong in terms of the ethics, administer one of those checklists, but you just have to make sure that you're clear to the fact finder in terms of what that means, because how would the fact finder know otherwise, right? How do they know the difference between a PAI or a MMPI and a trauma symptom checklist? How would you know? You wouldn't know. You don't understand statistics or how these things are researched. The other thing I'll say is, even if you did administer those tests and you didn't clarify clearly to the fact finder what those tests exactly mean, is that considered unethical? I don't know. I'm guessing to some, like Dr. Curry, it is considered unethical. I'm guessing to people like Dr. Hughes, it is not considered unethical. Otherwise, she wouldn't have done it, I'm guessing. Dr. Hughes doesn't seem like the sort of person who would wade into unethical territory without knowing it. She seems like she's pretty educated and knows all the things regarding ethics. I don't know that, of course. Now, someone like Dr. Spiegel seems like the sort of fellow who would wade into unethical waters either without knowing it or not caring. I don't know that, but that's just the way he came across to me.
There are limitations to our opinions, but we also need to provide the fact finder with information about what the potential implications or impact could actually be. So, for instance, if we use a scale that's idiosyncratic for the purpose, but we would first need to explain why we made that decision to not follow standard procedures. And then we would need to explain the use of this scale might introduce some potential exaggeration of this symptom, and so
Yeah, all this makes sense to me. I've been saying this from the beginning. That's what I was taught. That's what I would do if I did this sort of thing. It's obvious. I mean, why would you want to deceive people? Why would you want to come across like you're a deceptive individual, right? Yeah, that's my understanding. I just wonder what the consensus. I'm sure you could find a lot of people that would say, yes, Dr. Curry is right, that it is considered unethical not to provide the limitations of a particular instrument to the fact finder in a clear way. But I wonder if a lot of people don't really consider it necessary all the time.
Trying to control for that way, but that was one of the limitations of my opinion. You have to make it very clear. Transparency is really at the center of good science in general.
Yes, absolutely. Transparency is at the center of good science in general. Absolutely. Clearly, a lot of forensic psychologists and psychiatrists do not operate from that principle, though.
You have that main scale elevation, we call it positive impression management, was elevated. And then, because we want to make sure that somebody isn't elevating that scale just because they have such well-being, there are additional configurations of scales that you can look at to find out what's going on. And so the Cashel discriminant function is sort of the name of one of these configurations, these equations that are done. And she was highly elevated on that. In fact, that elevation tells you that no, this isn't accidental. This isn't because she's just doing so well in life that she is an extremely...
Wow. Now, given what we've heard from Dr. Curry in the past, I don't know exactly what she means by highly elevated, because she claimed a 3-6 code type with the only validity scale that could possibly come into play when you want to raise those numbers to cross the threshold into a zone where you could actually claim that someone is a 3-6 code type was an elevated K scale. But that doesn't necessarily mean that. We haven't been given the T-scores. So the PAI, she's saying elevated this and that. Now, does she come across as more believable? Yeah. But given the way she reported on the MPI, I think it calls that into question. I just wish she would just mention those numbers, because then I could tell you whether or not that's the way I would describe it, or the way that most people would describe it, because I would describe it the way most people do, because I just follow what the research says, as most people will as well. What does she mean by highly elevated? Because I'm guessing what's going to happen is Dr. Hughes is going to come, because that's what happened at the MMPI, was Dr. Curry administered it, said 3-6 code type, and I was like, whoa, interesting. I mean, that does say something. And then she was asked, did any of them rise above 65? And she said no. But she seemed to indicate they were close. But by what do you mean by close? Do we mean 62 or do we mean 59? Because these numbers, there's a huge difference between like 59 and 63. So what's close? And then what was the case? We're not given the information. So that's what happened. She said 3-6 code type, no qualifier, just 3-6 code type. Then later asked, well, they weren't above 65. You're like, well, you should have. So she's kind of saying that she committed an ethical violation because she didn't, which again, I wouldn't claim that because there's interpretation leeway. And Dr. Hughes came on and said it was a normal profile. And given the descriptions that I heard about the MMPI-2 that Amber heard, the results of hers, it did fit a quote unquote normal profile. Could you draw some conclusions or hypotheses from slight elevations in 3 and 6 with the K, with the slightly elevated K scale, or, who knows? All the other validity scales apparently on the MMPI-2 were fine. So yeah, most people in my book, maybe I was just around a lot of conservative people who were very careful about drawing conclusions. They would have looked at that MMPI and said, there's nothing you can say here. There's no reason to bump up these 3-6 scales. So she said those were elevated. Then Dr. Hughes said they weren't elevated. So when she says that the PAI was elevated in terms of the validity scales, indicating not only were the responses to the PAI indicating almost no pathology, which can either be someone minimizing their issues or their life is just going really well, but we have these additional scales that inform that particular validity scale, saying that the individual in fact was minimizing and their life isn't just going well. But I'm guessing Dr. Hughes is going to come on and say, no, that's not true. They weren't elevated. But unless we're given the number, I can't tell you who's right or wrong, which I'm guessing is just going to happen. Maybe one day when they make the documentary 20 years from now, they'll show us. And then I'll be sitting on the couch and I'll be like, yeah, well, actually, what I'll probably be doing is I'll be sitting here in front of y'all still reacting to various different things. I'll see you there. 20 years.
Dr. Hughes administered the MMPI-2, which I administered, where she can't quite figure out what the questions are asking. They seem really banal in general. On those, you see extreme defensiveness, minimization of any potential pathology, essentially presenting herself as perfect and free of any mental illness or personality disorder. But on the trauma symptom inventory, which Dr. Hughes administered, that was the one that I previously indicated for ease of explanation when the test results come out for.
Right. So I think what she's saying, I don't know, and I'm guessing I'm never going to know because I don't have what she's building these statements from. But what I think she's saying is that when it's easy to understand, well, she is saying this clearly, but I'll elaborate on it a little bit, that when the test is clearly evaluating whether or not someone has PTSD, the symptoms are very, very high. And when you're taking a test like the MMPI or PAI, where it's very unclear what the test is trying to get at, then not only do we not see exaggerated PTSD symptoms, but we actually see a minimization of everything. And yeah, absolutely, because PAI and MMPI will evaluate PTSD to an extent. It's possible that what Dr. Curry is talking about, I don't know, that on the PAI and on the MMPI, the results that indicate PTSD were actually minimized, whereas on the self-report measures, PTSD was exaggerated. So you would think there would be more data cohesion there, right? There would be elevated scales regarding PTSD in the PEI and in the NPI. I think what she's saying is there wasn't. That's interesting, right? To me, I think what that means is that Amber Heard probably, as I've been saying early on, probably does have some PTSD from her childhood, from Johnny Depp, as I've been saying. I think it's also possible that she absolutely knew and knows that she has borderline personality disorder. If I was to speculate, she has had borderline throughout her life and knows she has borderline and is in mild early recovery, I will say. She goes into the forensic evaluation and she's like, okay, here's my agenda. I definitely have PTSD and I need to demonstrate I have PTSD because that's my whole litigation thing against Johnny Depp. That's my technical term, litigation thing. And I do have PTSD, but if I just answer truthfully, it might not come across like I actually have PTSD. So I'm going to exaggerate that, even though I have PTSD to some extent, or I have trauma reactivity of some kind. But I don't have like the classic PTSD, but I'll drum that up a little bit because I do have issues. And if I come across like I have borderline to any of these forensic people, particularly Dr. Curry, I could lose this case because the stigma around borderline, or I don't know what the court's going to say about it. I don't want that to be a thing. So I get a question like, how often do you find yourself having emotional outbursts? Okay, well, that can't help me. And, how do we define that? A lot of people have emotional outbursts. What's so wrong with emotional outbursts? Okay, well, so not very often. You could see someone answering in those ways. And if that were true, which is just complete speculation, you could imagine that it's showing in the test data, according to Dr. Curry, of lots of endorsement of symptoms in PTSD. In fact, like severe end. And then all the other tests where it's not clear what it's getting at, extreme minimization of issues.
And so somebody who's intentionally trying to exaggerate PTSD, or possibly unintentionally, but nonetheless, who's exaggerating it, is likely to endorse these items, even though they're not real PTSD symptoms. Ms. Heard scored so highly on this that even if there is, although Dr. Hughes correctly said, there tends to be a negative skew when people have the high levels of distress that's associated with PTSD, so sometimes people score higher on this even when they do have PTSD. She scored so high that is effectively ruled out.
All right, that's convincing. I don't think we got a number on that scale, but what she's saying is that is a very, very high ATR, that if someone, Dr. Hughes pointed this out, has a lot of symptoms, then there will be an elevated ATR because the person is struggling a lot and they have very severe symptoms. And so it's a false positive of a feigning, right, of an exaggerated individual. But what Dr. Curry is saying is it was so high that just isn't possible. And what usually that means, Amber Heard answered positive to almost every single question that is thrown in there as a way of trying to determine if someone is lying. She described the items pretty well. There are items on this test, there'll be a question like that will be legitimately trying to get at PTSD, and it'll be something like, how often do you have flashbacks, or with the severity of your nightmares related to your trauma, that kind of thing. And then there'll be another question in there that'll say something like, my symptoms are so bad that I've gone 2 weeks without sleeping, or something like that. And that's not a thing. So if you didn't understand or you're trying to feign, you'll just be in this pattern of endorsing everything as severe.
10 days after I administered the CAPS-5 with Ms. Heard, that Dr. Hughes held an impromptu evaluation session remotely with Ms. Heard and administered the CAPS-5. She had previously diagnosed PTSD without using what we consider to be the gold standard PTSD diagnostic interview. And again, when we're doing a forensic evaluation, it is an important responsibility, and part of our ethics and professional standards are that we document everything to allow for transparency and full judicial scrutiny.
I think what one could imply, and again, this is all just speculation, we're always just thinking what would the jury think, is that Dr. Hughes, when she first got involved in the case in 2019, she had determined, based on perhaps a lot of interview data, that Amber Heard was a victim of Johnny Depp in terms of intimate partner violence and suffered from PTSD, and just decided, well, that's the way it is. I don't need any kind of testing to validate my conclusion because I know this to be true because of my experience and the interviews and all the things that I've read. But then when Dr. Curry gets involved, administers the CAPS-5 and hears about it, Dr. Hughes hears, oh, my posing forensic psychologist colleague is administering I better do that. So she did it later to try to make up for it. That's, I'm guessing, what is a story a juror could tell themselves. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that Dr. Hughes was trying to make up for the fact that she wasn't doing her job? Was she trying to get out ahead of what she knew would come through?
And Dr. Hughes administered incorrectly. She left huge sections, very relevant sections, blank. There's no way to understand why she scored it as high as she did based on the information that's provided. You're essentially supposed to notate the examinee's responses as verbatim as possible to explain your reasoning.
Yeah, so I don't know, because I didn't do this sort of thing when I was trained as a forensic psychologist, or I was trained in it, I don't remember. Graduate school can kind of be a blur. But what she's saying is that there were blank sections, and I think what Dr. Hughes would say, I don't know, I'm guessing they're going to bring her on, is that she was taking notes somewhere else. And or she took the responses verbally and did a mental coding and scoring in her head, which of course is completely against what these instruments are supposed to be for, right? But yeah, if you're trying to do a good job and you know that the opposing forensic psychologist is going to review your notes and materials, then why would you administer a CAPS-5 and not write down the responses? Because there's a possibility that Amber Heard does have PTSD and just is very bad at describing it or something, or no longer has PTSD, but she did in the past, even as a result of Johnny Depp. I don't know. But if you're trying to make a case that your client has PTSD, now, if Dr. Spiegel did this, I'd be like, well, Dr. Spiegel is going to Dr. Spiegel. Dr. Hughes is a super expert on these sorts of things. Now, one of the things that I wonder about with Dr. Hughes is that with all the things that we heard about in her resume, which was robust, I don't think I've ever heard of a CV that is more robust than hers in any area in my field. She has so many accolades and so many publications. But one of the things I was wondering about was, well, how much time do you have and all that stuff that you're doing to actually do forensic work? There's a possibility that she is a super expert in trauma, IPV, these kinds of things. But in terms of forensic psychology and in terms of knowing how to get out ahead of the opposition forensic psychologist, maybe she doesn't have a lot of experience in that. And she did the CAPS-5 and then like, I don't want to write it down. I'll just listen. Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then, I declare this person has PTSD. You're just going to have to take my word for it. I'm a super expert, instead of doing the work. I wonder if it also has to do again, this is just me just speculating, but people that are closer to graduate school, in my anecdotal experience, as Dr. Curry is, they tend to be much more meticulous about this sort of thing because graduate school scares the crap out of you. There's so many messages that are given to you in graduate school that just makes people so paranoid, to the effect that when I'm working with novice therapists and I'm supervising them, I always have to deprogram them from that paranoia to some extent. I want them to be concerned with ethics and being buttoned up, but the amount of, like, for example, one of the things that you'll learn in graduate school often, as a therapist, you're not supposed to take gifts from your clients. And a lot of novice therapists will walk away with the notion that it's a rule that you're never supposed to accept gifts, and it's unethical if you accept a gift from a client. And that's just simply not true. It's considered something that you definitely need to think about in terms of the ethics and the impact on therapy. The idea goes is that if you accept a gift, then it sets, especially if you elicit the gift or you leave it open-ended, like, oh, okay, good. Other people, they never give me gifts. And so it's nice that finally someone gives me a gift. Well, now the client probably feels some obligation to give you a gift. And that throws a wrench potentially into the treatment. It's distracting. It creates a situation where they're trying to please you. They're trying to guess what you want. They might buy you very expensive gifts and da-da-da. They might feel like they deserve something in return if they give you a gift. Like, You're not supposed to confront them on their issues anymore if they got, it's just, we want to stay away from that, right? But if you do accept a gift for whatever reason, that doesn't mean they're going to put you in therapist jail. Because some novice therapists, they freak out. The client shows up and they have a Christmas gift or something. They're like, hey, I got something for you. And the therapist doesn't know what to do because it's very rude to just like, no, I won't accept that. I mean, there are very effective, non-rude ways of saying like, oh, this is so nice. I'm sorry, but it's unethical for me to accept gifts from people. I'm so sorry about that. Oh, there's ways, or you accept the gift and you say that you're going to put it in the lobby. It's like, oh, I can't accept this, but I'm going to give it to the whole office because it's unethical for me to actually accept a gift. But if you want to give a gift to the whole agency, or if it's a toy that you want to donate to the playroom or something, then you can certainly do that. You don't have to, and I don't recommend you get into a habit of that because I want you to come here and this to be about you. So, that's an example. Like an example from my practice that I often talk about is I used to do in-home therapy, and I was working with a Mexican immigrant family, undocumented, and I was going into the home. And not only was I helping them therapy-wise, mental health-wise, but I was also helping them with understanding how to integrate themselves and acclimate to Seattle. And they were very thankful about that, and they were very nice people. And I showed up one time, and they made me a bunch of tamales. And I love tamales. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Is it tamales? Tamales? Anyway, the sort of cornbread things, and they're wrapped up and there's meat on the inside. It's so good. It's homemade. I mean, it's just, and so they give me a box of them, a Tupperware, and I'm sitting on their couch, and their 4 kids are over here and the 2 parents are over here, and they give me the tamales, and I feel like they called them tamales. But maybe Americans call them tamales. Anyway, I had a split second to think about it because that's usually how these gifts work, is they're usually out of the blue. And it's not something that we tell our clients all the time. We don't say at the beginning of every session, by the way, I don't want any gifts. Clients, even if you mention it in the first session, they might forget. And so by the 25th session, they give you a gift, And so I get this gift and I have to make this very quick calculation because my instinct is to say, oh, I'm sorry. Because that was another thing when I did in-home family therapy is, as a courtesy, people would always offer me food or water or a drink or something. And as a policy, I always just said no, even though there were times when I actually would have enjoyed it. But I didn't want to set that up because if I did, I suspected that people, when I came to the next session, they would have an elaborate sort of setup for me to eat. And I was doing this work in my 20s, and so I probably would have, enjoyed, and I was poor and trying to pay off. So I probably would have liked it, and so maybe that's another reason why I declined it. The other thing is it just distracts. I want to do my work, and the other thing is, I'll see 8 clients a day in their houses, and if I'm constantly eating and drinking, like goodness. Anyway, so normally I would say, oh no, but I had this thought because the emotional landscape of this gift was much bigger than a typical like, hey, would you like food? We just made these. It felt and was this offering from an undocumented family who had almost nothing, couldn't give me anything. They weren't paying for my services. The government was paying for my services. They were thankful, not just as a therapist, which of course is a very important role, if I don't say so myself, but also just as like a cultural liaison, a welcoming committee. It makes me want to cry just thinking about it. They were the nicest people. And they were wanting to give me something as a thank you, like, okay, I had to stop it so I could cry a little bit. I'm often talking about how we should all, particularly men, should be leading the way with crying, but I don't know. Give me time to just full on cry on camera in one of these videos, but you'll know I've crossed a certain maturity threshold when that happens, or some kind of threshold, something good. I'm not there yet. Anyway, so I'm getting this gift, and I very quickly have a second. I'm like, because they made this for me. This wasn't just extra from they like wrapped it, and it's in a thing. It's for me, and I felt I could therapeutically do something for them by accepting this gift and by eating it. It's not just like a trinket for it's like something that is sustenance. It gives me life and is an offering of their culture and of their worth and of their self-esteem. they're good at making these. This is a part of where they're from. You know, just everything wrapped up in that culture and value, and you know, they're important too. They have worth too, you know? And I accepted it. And I enjoyed them. I ate the crap out of those things, and I told them so because I, you know, felt like it was therapeutic to tell them that they mattered. Okay, so I had to take a break. I've told that story many times. I've never, I don't think ever cried telling that story. I think it's worthy of crying. I think there's a lot of things to cry about, but I don't know why after all these years of thinking about that moment, and does it have to do with the news? Maybe, I don't know. So anyway, getting back to my original point was that Dr. Curry is closer to graduate school and perhaps more paranoid about things and more buttoned up about things. And Dr. Hughes, having graduated, I think, around the time that I did in the 90s, maybe for her, she's further away from her paranoia about being buttoned up around the protocols. And it's showing in the procedure that she followed, and Dr. Curry is able to point at that. Another aspect of this is that when you are very respected, and I've seen that in myself, honestly, that you end up feeling as though you can do anything. You end up thinking like, I can cut corners there because, you know, who's going to stand in my... You don't think that way necessarily, but, you know, when you're early career, you have a lot of bosses and a lot of people who are like, oh, you're new, you know, what's going on with you? You have to always prove yourself to other people. Whereas when you cross a certain threshold and you're considered like upper echelon in your field, you are given a temptation to believe that you don't need to follow the rules anymore. And I've seen that before. I've seen some pretty senior leaders in my field that I know personally who would be saying things that I was just like, what did you just say? Whoa, I can't believe you just... Or cutting ethical corners that they know they shouldn't cut. So I don't. Now, do I have any idea about Hughes or Curry? No. I'm just talking about my own experience, of course.
Dr. Hughes further invalidated it by trying to show that she had assessed for the childhood trauma impact, and she had said that she went back and asked the childhood question, but you can't do that. If you're assessing for two separate periods of one's life to find out their relatedness to PTSD, you do two separate CAPS interviews, period. You don't create your own question system. That is non-standard administration of the...
Right. That's what I was saying, and she was saying that in order for the findings of the test to be considered valid, you have to follow the protocol because the data that supports the gold standard, CAPS-5, and what they mean by gold standard is that it's through research and through consensus considered to be the instrument that gets at what you're trying to get at, i.e. whether or not someone has PTSD or not. So in order for the findings, and especially if you're going to base your opinion on the findings, if you break from that protocol at all, you are stepping outside of the research, and thus nothing can be said about the results because you didn't follow the standard, right?
Test, and it invalidates it. On the personality assessment inventory, so first she failed to mention that there were clear indications of response distortion. She also failed to mention that Ms. Hurd scored in her score profile, again, so there are main scores. She did elevate a score for the borderline personality disorder sort of section, but that in and of itself would not indicate a diagnosis. However, the configuration of her scores overall is consistent with that, and in fact, it's one of the diagnostic suggestions given by the test itself.
I don't know what level she's talking about, but I'm going to take a guess and say that it's similar to the 3-6. That wasn't officially an elevation, but could be interpreted that way by some evaluators. That on the PAI, there was an indication of borderline, perhaps. It wasn't a clear indication. And of course, even if there was a clear indication, you wouldn't diagnose from that. But Dr. Curry is saying that she had test score results indicating a good possibility of borderline. And then when you match it up with other scales, I'm guessing the validity scales involving minimizing one's symptoms, then you could raise that that borderline score up even higher and thus cross a certain threshold indicating a strong possibility of borderline. I'm going to take a guess and say that Dr. Hughes would say, no, that isn't the way I interpreted it because that's not the way a lot of people interpret it. I'm guessing it's somewhere in that middle zone, which of course is why when we're diagnosing people, we don't rely on these instruments because they are not always an indication of what's going on.
And then also there's a configuration around Ms. Heard's trauma responses on that particular test, which demonstrates that it is more likely that those symptoms were reported in relation to something in the distant childhood. It's more consistent with childhood chronic abuse than present circumstances or recent circumstances.
Yeah, but does it say that definitively? No. And I'm sure Dr. Hughes would say, okay, sure, if you looked at just that item, then okay. But I did a thorough examination. I read the records from previous therapists, and one of the previous therapists indicated no signs of PTSD. But then mid-Johnny Depp relationship, that therapist did report evidence of PTSD. And so based on that, that's much stronger evidence than just a random algorithm on the PAI. I'm just going to take a guess about that. Not to say that either perspective is right or wrong, but I'm just guessing that's what Dr. Hughes would say with some validity.
I would say the main issue was that she said that Ms. Heard obtained a normal profile on my MMPI too.
All right. How do you disagree with Dr. Hughes relative to the profile?
Okay, so the profile was not normal. So Ms. Heard already had subtle elevations just by the test by itself as it came out. There were subtle elevations.
So this is going to be good. I hope we get a number. I'm guessing we're not. Yeah, she's talking about subtle elevations in 3-6, I believe. From my understanding of where those elevations are, conservative evaluators would interpret that as not indicating anything. And you couldn't draw any conclusions based on how high they were elevated, even with an elevated K-scale. I'm guessing on that. So, I've been talking about a T-score of 65. For some evaluators, they will say, unless it's 65, there's nothing you can say. Unless there's a strong indication that you can bump it up because of a pretty obvious effort to downplay one's symptoms or lying that's happening. But even then, sometimes conservative evaluators will say, well, I don't know if I'm supposed to elevate that. I just know that this test is invalid because the person was clearly lying or confused or something. And so I have to look at some, or I have to re-administer it, or who knows. But for some people, anything below a 65 is normal. For some people, 65 to 60, 60 to 65 is considered interpretable as a moderate issue, meaning that it's a degree. If above 65 is a severe issue, and below 65 and between 60 and 65, you have a moderate issue. I was taught the moderate issue.
If the validity scales hadn't been as elevated as they were, you might have said this person has some traits, but this isn't necessarily at the level of a true pathology. However, Ms. Heard elevated a scale that essentially is a defensiveness scale on this test. And when you're giving this test, you always are mindful of different norms or groups who may have similar profiles. And there are certain groups of litigants who tend to elevate this scale as well. So I had that in mind. However, Ms. Heard elevated this so much that it was far beyond the mean for the litigants that are known to have the highest levels.
Okay, what she's saying there is research, or at least an understanding, that when you are the opposing forensic psychologist, you're commonly going to see an elevation, I think, in the K-scale is what she's referring to. And so that has to be taken into consideration because the person that you're assessing is a little defensive to you from the get-go. And so a little bit of an elevation in the K-scale is normal to that situation and shouldn't indicate that invalidates the test or that all the scales should be raised up. But what she's saying is that the K-scale was so high that it was even beyond the typical litigant normal defensiveness that you will see. Okay, I've been talking about the K-scale, and from my memory, there's actually an algorithm that the computer will use to raise different scales at different rates, and maybe even lower some scales. So I don't know, I can't really know anything unless I saw the results, and I'm guessing I never will. But I'm going to take a guess and say that the score was somewhere around 60. And to some forensic psychologists, that indicates something to look at. And with an elevated K scale, well, yes, I'm just gonna bump all that up. And given the demeanor of the individual, given everything else that I heard, I don't think it's much of a stretch to make the interpretation that this is a full-blown 3-6 code type. Whereas another person looks at it and the 60 and if no other validity scales are elevated, then it's just like, nope, normal.
Of this scale, this defensiveness scale. And when this scale is elevated to the level that it is, you automatically understand that it is very likely that those clinical scales, I keep doing this because I'm seeing it in my head, it looks like sort of an ECT. It's sort of these peaks you see on a graph. And when you see these peaks, and you have this huge peak over here for the defensiveness scale, what you know is that these peaks are artificially, they've been lowered or suppressed based on the respondent being so defensive.
Again, it's been a long time since I've studied this sort of thing, but from my memory, that isn't entirely true because there are, again, many validity scales and there are typical validity scale presentations that are indicative of what she's talking about. Just a spike in K alone, I don't think from my memory is interpreted that way. One could interpret it that way, but I don't think it's a strong claim of that interpretation.
And you have this huge peak over here for the defensiveness scale. What you know is that these peaks are artificially, they've been lowered or suppressed based on the respondent being so defensive. They still detected what's likely there for her, but it's not as high as it should be. So you make an adjustment. And the recommendation is that anything at 60 or above, we call it a T-score of 60, or above is considered significant. Ms. Hers were already over 60.
Oh, we still got a range because we were talking about 55. I think she's going to say there was one that was highly above 60, meaning like 64, because if there was a 65, we would have heard it. I think she said 3-6 code type, which usually means the 3 was the higher, so maybe like a 64 on the 3 and a 62 on the 6 or something. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people would interpret that, even without the K elevation, as interpretable, especially when you suspect that the individual is trying to minimize things. And 3-6 code type, they tend to minimize things anyway, for a number of reasons. One is that they are considered and described to be immature, lacking insight, also lacking responsibility, self-centered. You know, when you ask a child what their issues are, you know, a child that's raised well and hasn't been told there's a bunch of things wrong with them, about their flaws, you know, kids don't necessarily have a grasp on their full personality and the impact they have on other people. And we would expect that. We would want that. We don't want them to be super aware of all those things right off the bat. So, you know, there's some benefits to having ignorance about those things until you're older and can handle it. And those kinds of maturities and differentiations and wisdoms develop as we get older. So for some people who have a lot of relational traumas, they retain that point of view, that self-centered, immature, lacking insight. I don't have issues. You know, I can't tell you how many times I'd be talking to a teenager or someone in their early 20s, and there's just clear issues going on with them, and they would just be in complete denial. And when I would talk to someone older, and I would have some ability to be like, well, you know, not everyone's perfect, so let's talk about this. And, you know, they might, well, okay. But you talk to someone below 25, particularly below 20, it's just like impossible for them. Not all of them. Many of them are very mature, very able, but especially if you've been through some stuff, you have some defensiveness. That for these individuals, it was just like impossible for me to get them to talk about anything involving their personality with regards to maybe they interpret things a little interesting, you know, everyone. And I would do everything. I would pull out all the things and I would say, I have issues. Let me tell you about my issues. And I didn't like to admit that at the beginning, but now I admit that to myself and I've benefited from it. And I've realized that everyone has issues. Everyone has issues. Let's talk about yours. I don't have issues. And they believe it. You know, it's not like a game they're playing. It's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm perfect. Everyone else is screwed up.
Quite higher than that. And then you see a very clear profile. And that was how I got that. I had mentioned a 3-6 code type. Now, the test does its own correction also for some of the scores, but not the ones that are her main code type. With the test correction, she had a 1-3-6 code type, which is very similar.
Yeah, that was my suspicion. I mean, I didn't remember specifically, but you heard me say that an elevated K means that they will correct the scales. Some scales are shifted up a lot, some scales aren't adjusted at all, and she said that the 3-6 actually isn't adjusted by the K. So I'm actually surprised why she isn't bringing up the 136 code type, because that would, I think, even further bolster her claim, because a 136 code type is even stronger of an indication of the thing she's saying, with an added tendency to have conversions and somatic issues that are psychological in nature, psychogenic pain, psychogenic fatigue, psychogenic headaches, these kinds of things, meaning that because of stress, or you just convert your stress into physical symptoms, that they will have a 136 code type. But, an elevation in scale 1 is similar to what she's been saying. Someone who has lack of insight, someone who might be demanding of other people, someone who might be self-centered and narcissistic, and not always, but certainly can be. So I'm wondering why she's leaving out the elevation in scale 1. Maybe it wasn't that high or something. But yeah, so Dr. Hughes could easily say, well, okay, there was an elevated K, but with K correction, it still doesn't push the 3-6 above a 65, and thus many people would interpret that as normal or non-interpretable or something. A lot of people would, especially between 60 and 65.
To report that they lose their temper, and when they lose their temper, it explodes. We have sort of what we call a cookbook for these code types, which will provide you with all the information that's been researched to be associated with them. And our cookbook actually states that 3-6 profile specifically tends to be associated with cruel and ruthless behavior, particularly to those who they perceive as less powerful than them and subordinates.
Yeah, I mean, cruelty, I think that's going a little far. Certainly, there is research to support that, but I wouldn't say that's a central feature. But, if you're trying to make a case for something, you'd want to emphasize that. But the first set of associations are much more the kind of central features: the lack of insight, the hostility, the blaming other people, the self-centeredness, that kind of thing. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really, really do.